Growing up, it always felt like I was the extra in my own family, a placeholder while the real star took the stage. That star was my younger brother, Alex. From the moment he could walk, it was clear he was the golden child. My parents doted on him endlessly, turning a blind eye to his flaws while holding me to standards I could never seem to meet. I was the quieter one, the one who kept to myself, preferring books and hobbies over the chaotic energy of family gatherings. Alex, on the other hand, thrived in the spotlight. His boisterous laughter filled every room, and his charm was magnetic. He always knew how to say just the right thing to get what he wanted, even if it meant manipulating those around him. While he was lavished with praise, I was expected to make sacrifices, helping with his homework, cleaning up his messes, even giving up things I wanted so he could have them instead. If I ever tried to push back, I'd be met with lectures about how family takes care of each other, or how I needed to set a good example as the older sibling. My father was more hands-off, focusing on work, but my mother's favoritism was blatant and unwavering. Over the years, Alex began to see how far he could push me. As a kid, it was pranks and teasing, little things that my parents would brush off as sibling rivalry. But as we grew older, his behavior turned mean-spirited. He would undermine me at every turn, whether it was sabotaging school projects or mocking my achievements in front of others. To him, my successes were a threat, something that needed to be diminished. I tried to rise above it. I poured my energy into school, convinced that if I worked hard enough, I could carve out a life of my own, something separate from the shadow Alex cast over me. But even then, it felt like I couldn't escape him. When I got into my dream college, my parents' excitement was muted compared to their celebration when Alex got a passing grade in his classes. The message was clear. No matter what I did, Alex would always matter more. Despite the resentment that simmered beneath the surface, I kept trying to earn their approval. I told myself that if I could just be patient, if I could just prove my worth, things would change. But deep down, I knew better. In their eyes, Alex could do no wrong, and I would never truly measure up. As I packed my bags for college, I felt a mixture of relief and sadness. Leaving home meant leaving behind years of feeling invisible, but it also meant accepting that my relationship with my family might never be what I wanted it to be. Still, I clung to a shred of hope. Maybe distance would help. Maybe, away from Alex's antics and my parents' favoritism, I could finally become my own person. But even as I left, I couldn't shake the feeling that the story with Alex wasn't over. I just didn't realize how deeply he would entangle himself in my life again, and how devastating his betrayal would eventually be. Life away from home was a breath of fresh air. For the first time, I felt like I could breathe without Alex suffocating me with his constant antics. College gave me the chance to reinvent myself, to find people who valued me for who I was, not for how much I could tolerate or endure. It was during those years that I met Linda. Linda had a way of making me feel seen in a way no one else ever had. She was vibrant, ambitious, and grounded, the kind of person who could light up a room without even trying. I'll admit I was cautious at first. Being around Alex my whole life had made me wary of trusting people too quickly, but Linda's kindness and warmth slowly broke through those walls. We started dating in my second year of college, and by the time we graduated, I knew she was the one I wanted to spend my life with. When I proposed, it wasn't some elaborate affair, just the two of us, in the park where we had spent so many weekends together. She said yes without hesitation, and for once, I felt like I had finally won something that was mine and mine alone. Introducing Linda to my family was something I had both anticipated and dreaded. I wanted her to understand where I came from, but I was nervous about how Alex would act. Predictably, he made an impression. From the moment Linda walked through the door, Alex turned on his charm. He was suddenly the perfect brother, friendly, funny, and far too interested in Linda. At the time, I chalked it up to him trying to make a good impression, maybe even overcompensating because of our strained relationship. Linda seemed to get along with everyone, including Alex, and for a while, I was relieved. She made an effort to connect with my parents, spent time helping my mom in the kitchen, and even encouraged me to mend fences with Alex. It felt like things were falling into place, like maybe my family could finally be part of my happiness. But then, little things started to nag at me. Alex began inserting himself into our plans. If Linda and I went to see a movie during a visit home, Alex would tag along. If we had dinner with my parents, Alex would always find a way to dominate the conversation, turning Linda's attention toward him. At first, I convinced myself it was harmless. After all, he was my brother. Maybe he was trying to make up for all those years of being distant. It wasn't until our engagement party that I started to see things differently. My parents had insisted on hosting it, and Alex had taken it upon himself to help with the planning. He spent the entire evening hovering near Linda, cracking jokes and complimenting her dress. He barely spoke to me, except for a few thinly veiled jabs about how lucky I was to have found someone like her. That night, as I watched him laughing with Linda, a familiar feeling crept in. The same feeling I'd had as a kid when Alex would take something that was mine just because he could. It was like he couldn't stand to see me happy without finding a way to insert himself into it. Even so, I brushed it off. I told myself I was being paranoid, that Alex was just being Alex. After all, Linda loved me. She had chosen me. I had no reason to doubt her or our relationship. But looking back, I realize how blind I was to the subtle ways Alex was already weaving himself into our lives. His charm wasn't harmless. It was calculated. And while I tried to ignore it, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was waiting for the perfect opportunity to remind me that nothing in my life was truly mine. Not even Linda. After the engagement party, life moved forward, though not without its bumps. Wedding planning became an all-consuming task, and I threw myself into making sure everything would be perfect for Linda. She seemed happy, excited, even, but every so often, I caught her distracted, her phone lighting up with messages she quickly dismissed. I wasn't one to pry, but something about her sudden need for privacy struck me as odd. When I asked if everything was okay, she'd wave it off, saying it was just her friends asking about wedding details. I told myself it made sense. People loved weddings, and Linda was the kind of person everyone gravitated toward. Why wouldn't her friends be reaching out constantly? Still, there were moments I couldn't ignore. Alex began showing up unannounced more frequently, claiming he was in the area or just wanted to spend time with us. At first, I appreciated the effort. Maybe he was trying to repair the rift between us. Linda encouraged me to let him in, saying family was important and that we'd regret it later if we didn't make an effort now. But it wasn't long before Alex's presence started to feel suffocating. He inserted himself into every aspect of our lives. If I mentioned a honeymoon destination to Linda, Alex would chime in with better suggestions. If I asked Linda about wedding colors, Alex somehow had an opinion too. At one point, I even joked about him being more invested in the wedding than we were, but the laughter didn't quite reach my eyes. Then there were the subtle shifts in Linda's behavior. She became more defensive when I asked simple questions, like why she'd spent so much time texting during dinner or why Alex seemed to know things about our wedding plans before I did. She brushed it off as paranoia on my part, saying I was stressed from work and planning. Her reassurances should have comforted me, but instead, they left me feeling more unsettled. I couldn't put my finger on it, but something was off. It wasn't just her words. It was the way she avoided looking me in the eye when she said them, the way her voice wavered just enough to make me wonder. The first real crack came one evening when I came home early from work. Linda had mentioned she'd be running errands, so I didn't expect to see Alex's car parked in front of our apartment. My stomach churned as I stepped inside and heard their voices from the living room. They weren't arguing, but there was an intensity in their tones that made me freeze in the hallway. When they noticed me, Linda quickly stood up, her face a mixture of surprise and something else I couldn't quite read. Alex, ever the smooth talker, laughed it off, saying he had just stopped by to check in on us. Linda nodded too quickly, agreeing and ushering him toward the door. I didn't question them. Not then. I didn't want to seem insecure or controlling, so I let it go. But the seed of doubt had been planted, and it grew faster than I could manage. From then on, every interaction between Alex and Linda felt like it was hiding something. The way she laughed a little too hard at his jokes, or the way he'd linger just a bit too long when he hugged her goodbye, it all felt wrong. I tried to push the thoughts away, to focus on the wedding and the life we were building. But the signs kept piling up. Linda started coming home later than usual, with vague excuses about work or errands. Alex, who once never cared about our conversations, suddenly seemed to know things about our schedules and plans before I even told him. One evening, As I sat at the kitchen table staring at my laptop, I felt the weight of everything pressing down on me. I thought about confronting Linda, about demanding answers. But what if I was wrong? What if my suspicions were just the result of years of being overshadowed by Alex? The thought of losing Linda, or worse, finding out my fears were true, paralyzed me. Still, I couldn't ignore the unease gnawing at my gut. Something was happening, something that would eventually shatter the life I was trying so desperately to hold together. I just didn't know how close I was to the breaking point. The truth, when it finally came, didn't reveal itself in one dramatic moment. It was more like a series of small cracks in a fragile surface, each one widening until the whole thing came crashing down. It started with Linda's phone. One evening, while she was in the shower, her phone lit up with a message. I wouldn't normally invade her privacy, but something about the way she had been guarding that phone for weeks, keeping it face down, carrying it everywhere, even to the bathroom, made my heart race with suspicion. The name on the screen stopped me cold. It was Alex. I stared at the notification for what felt like an eternity, my mind racing through every possible explanation. Maybe it was something innocent. Maybe it was about the wedding. But deep down, I knew better. My hands trembled as I picked up the phone, my instincts screaming at me to put it down, but I couldn't stop myself. The message was short and innocuous at first glance. Let me know when you're free. Can't stop thinking about the other night. The words felt like a slap to the face. My breath caught in my throat as I opened the thread, scrolling through a series of messages that confirmed my worst fears. They weren't just talking, they were planning, scheming, reminiscing about nights they'd spent together. The language was careful, nothing outright explicit, but the meaning was unmistakable. My stomach churned as I pieced it all together. The late nights, the secretive glances, the way Alex had suddenly inserted himself into our lives, it all made sense now. They had been seeing each other behind my back, right under my nose. I sat there, numb, as the sound of the shower continued in the background. Part of me wanted to confront Linda the moment she walked out, to demand an explanation, to scream at her for betraying me. But another part of me, the part that had been conditioned to stay quiet, to avoid conflict, to suppress my own needs for the sake of others, held me back. When Linda finally came out of the bathroom, wrapped in a towel and humming to herself, I couldn't even look at her. She smiled at me, oblivious to the storm brewing inside me, and asked what I wanted for dinner. I mumbled something about not being hungry and left the room, clutching my phone so tightly my knuckles turned white. The next few days were a blur. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't focus on anything but the betrayal that now hung over every moment. I replayed every interaction with Alex and Linda in my mind, dissecting every detail, wondering how I could have been so blind. The most excruciating part was pretending everything was fine. I didn't want to confront her until I had more clarity, more evidence. I didn't want her to twist the narrative or deny what I had seen. So I stayed silent, watching her every move, waiting for the right moment to act. That moment came sooner than I expected. One evening, I told Linda I had to work late, but instead, I parked my car down the street and waited. It wasn't long before Alex's car pulled into the driveway. I watched as he let himself in, greeted warmly by Linda. The way they embraced confirmed everything. I felt like an outsider in my own life, sitting there in the dark while the people I trusted most destroyed everything I had built. My hands clenched the steering wheel, my mind torn between bursting in and exposing them and driving away to escape the unbearable truth. Eventually, Alex left, and Linda went about her evening as if nothing had happened. I sat there, frozen, as the weight of what I'd witnessed settled over me. There was no going back now, no pretending this wasn't real. The life I had envisioned, the future I had fought so hard to create, had been ripped away from me, and the people I thought I could trust had been the ones to do it. I drove around aimlessly that night, the tears coming in waves as anger, betrayal, and heartbreak warred inside me. I didn't know what to do or where to go. All I knew was that nothing would ever be the same again. The confrontation I had dreaded came sooner than I wanted. The morning after seeing Alex leave our house, I sat in the kitchen, the sleepless night etched into my face. Linda walked in, cheerful and oblivious, talking about some mundane detail of her day. I couldn't listen to her anymore, couldn't stand the sound of her voice pretending that nothing was wrong. I placed my coffee cup down and told her I knew everything. My voice was calm, too calm for the storm raging inside me, but I was determined not to let my emotions take control. Her smile faltered, and she froze, staring at me like I had just pulled the rug out from under her. At first, she denied it. She told me I was imagining things, that I was letting my insecurities get the better of me. But I didn't let her derail me. I laid out everything: the messages, the visits, the lies. Slowly, her denial turned to excuses. She claimed Alex had been going through a hard time, that she had only been trying to support him, that it wasn't what I thought. But it was exactly what I thought, and we both knew it. Her tone shifted again, this time to anger. She accused me of spying on her, of invading her privacy, of being controlling. The irony was almost laughable. She was trying to turn this on me, to paint herself as the victim. It was as if she thought if she deflected enough, I'd forget that she and Alex had betrayed me in the worst way imaginable. The breaking point came when I told her I had seen Alex at the house. The look on her face, panic mixed with guilt, was all the confirmation I needed. She finally stopped pretending and sat there, silent, as I told her how much she had destroyed. I could barely look at her. The woman I had loved, the woman I had wanted to spend my life with, had been lying to me for months. And for what? For Alex. The brother who had spent his entire life tearing me down? When she spoke again, it wasn't an apology. Instead, it was a justification. She said she and Alex had a connection, that it had been building for a long time, that she didn't mean for it to happen but couldn't help it. The words cut deeper than I thought possible. She didn't sound remorseful, she sounded defensive, as though her actions were somehow excusable. The next confrontation came with Alex. I hadn't planned on seeing him, but my parents had invited me over for dinner, and I needed to clear my head. I thought maybe being around them, even with all their flaws, might offer some comfort. I hadn't told them what I'd discovered yet. I wasn't ready for that conversation. Alex showed up halfway through the evening, his usual smirk plastered across his face. He acted as if nothing had happened, as if he hadn't just shattered my life. I couldn't hold back anymore. I told him I knew, that Linda had told me everything, that I had seen the messages. He didn't even try to deny it. Instead, he shrugged and told me I was overreacting. He said it wasn't a big deal, that these things happen, and I needed to move on. His arrogance, his complete lack of remorse, made my blood boil. My parents, who had been sitting there in stunned silence, finally chimed in, but not in the way I had hoped. They turned their attention to Alex, asking him what he had been thinking, but their tone wasn't one of condemnation, it was one of disappointment, like he had made a minor mistake rather than an unforgivable betrayal. When I told them how deeply this had hurt me, how it had destroyed everything I had been building, they tried to downplay it. My mother said I needed to forgive him because family is family. My father muttered something about how people make mistakes, as though this was just another one of Alex's childish pranks. I felt completely alone. The people who were supposed to have my back, who should have stood by me, were more concerned with protecting Alex than acknowledging my pain. That was the moment I realized I couldn't stay. I couldn't keep subjecting myself to their blind loyalty to Alex, their inability to see the damage he had caused. If they couldn't support me now, in my darkest moment, then they never truly had. I left that night, not just their house but their lives. I didn't tell them where I was going or what my plans were. I just knew I needed to get away. From Alex, from Linda, from all of it. The weight of their betrayal was too much to carry, and I wasn't going to let it crush me any longer. As I drove away, I felt the sting of loss, but there was also a sense of relief. For the first time in my life, I wasn't trying to fix things, to make people see my worth. I was choosing myself, even if it meant leaving everything behind. Leaving wasn't easy, but staying would have been impossible. I packed up my life in a single weekend, throwing everything I owned into boxes and bags. As I loaded them into my car, I realized how little I truly had. Some clothes, a few sentimental items, and whatever small comforts I could fit into the trunk. Everything else, including the life I had built with Linda, was being left behind. Linda didn't try to stop me. Maybe she knew there was nothing left to say, or maybe she didn't care enough to try. Either way, Her silence only deepened the ache in my chest. This was the woman I had planned to marry, the woman I had trusted with every part of me, and now she was watching me walk out the door without so much as a word. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. Not my parents, not Alex, and certainly not Linda. I needed space, distance from the house where I had been betrayed, from the family who had always chosen Alex over me, from the toxic memories that seemed to linger in every corner of my life. I drove for hours, aimlessly at first, until I ended up in a quiet little town I'd never heard of before. It was the kind of place where nobody knew your name, where you could start over without anyone asking questions. It felt like exactly what I needed. I rented a small apartment on the edge of town, barely big enough for the few belongings I had brought with me. It wasn't much, but it was mine. For the first time in years, I felt like I had control over something in my life. The days that followed were a blur of unpacking and trying to figure out what came next. My mind was a battlefield, torn between the anger I felt toward Alex and Linda and the sadness of losing everything I had worked so hard to build. There were moments when I questioned whether I had made the right decision, whether walking away was worth the pain of starting over. But then I'd think about Alex's smug face, about Linda's empty apologies, about the way my parents had dismissed my pain, and the doubt would fade. I couldn't keep living for other people, constantly bending to their needs and ignoring my own. Walking away wasn't just about leaving the past behind, it was about choosing myself for once. I spent the first few weeks in that town keeping to myself, avoiding people and focusing on putting one foot in front of the other. I got a job at a local hardware store, something simple and unassuming that let me keep my head down while I figured out my next move. The work was repetitive, but there was something therapeutic about it. Stocking shelves and helping customers gave me a sense of purpose, however small. It wasn't the life I had envisioned, but it was a start. Nights were harder. The quiet of my apartment left too much room for my thoughts to spiral. I'd lie awake, replaying everything in my mind, the lies, the betrayal, the confrontation with Alex. Sleep rarely came, and when it did, it was filled with restless dreams that left me more exhausted than before. But slowly, things began to change. I started taking walks around town, exploring the parks and quiet streets. I'd sit by the lake for hours, letting the sound of the water calm the storm inside me. It was during one of those walks that I realized I hadn't thought about Alex or Linda for an entire afternoon. The weight that had been pressing on my chest for weeks felt just a little lighter. It wasn't much, but it was progress. For the first time in what felt like forever, I began to feel like maybe, just maybe, I could find a way to move forward. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew I wasn't going back. The chapter of my life that included Alex, Linda, and the family who had failed me was over. Now it was time to start writing a new one where I didn't have to sacrifice my happiness for people who didn't value me. Walking away had been the hardest decision I'd ever made, but it was also the first step toward something better. And for the first time in years, I felt like I was finally heading in the right direction. Starting over was both terrifying and liberating. For the first time, I was free from the constant weight of family expectations, free from the toxic pull of Alex and Linda. But freedom, as I quickly learned, wasn't the same as happiness. There were days when the loneliness felt unbearable, when the emptiness of my new apartment echoed the emptiness in my chest. I threw myself into my new job at the hardware store. The simplicity of it was grounding, almost meditative. Helping customers find the right tools or stocking aisles didn't require much thought, and for a while, that was what I needed. Something to keep my hands busy and my mind quiet. Over time, I began to establish a routine. I'd wake up early, make coffee, and sit by the window, watching the town slowly come to life. After work, I'd go for long walks, discovering hidden corners of the town. A bookstore with creaky wooden floors, a park with winding trails, and a small diner that served the best pie I'd ever tasted. It was a quiet life, but it was mine. As weeks turned into months, I started to meet new people. It was nothing dramatic, just small connections here and there. A coworker who'd invite me out for a drink after work. A neighbor who'd nod hello as we crossed paths in the hallway. A retired man I'd see at the park almost every afternoon, who eventually began sharing stories about his fishing trips. It was through these small interactions that I began to feel like I was part of something again. The town, with its unassuming charm and kind-hearted people, slowly began to feel like home. It was during one of those walks that I met Anna. She owned the bookstore I'd stumbled upon weeks earlier, a cozy little shop tucked away on a side street. I had gone in a few times, browsing aimlessly, but one day she struck up a conversation. She had a warmth about her that immediately put me at ease, and before I knew it, we were talking about everything from our favorite books to the quirks of small-town life. Anna wasn't like Linda. She wasn't flashy or overly confident. She was quiet, thoughtful, and genuine. There was no pretense with her, no need to put on a show. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could let my guard down. Our friendship grew slowly, built on shared conversations and casual outings. She'd recommend books for me to read, and I'd tell her about the best trails to explore in the area. It wasn't romantic, not at first, but there was a connection there, something that felt real and unforced. One evening, as we sat on a bench by the lake, watching the sun dip below the horizon, she asked about my past. I hesitated, unsure of how much to share. But there was something in her eyes, a quiet understanding, that made me feel safe. I told her everything. About Alex, about Linda, about the betrayal that had torn my life apart. She listened without interrupting, her expression soft but steady. When I finished, she didn't offer empty platitudes or try to fix me. She simply said, "That must have been so hard," and let the silence sit between us. That moment stayed with me. It was the first time I had felt truly heard, truly understood. Anna didn't see me as broken or damaged. She saw me as someone who had been through something difficult and was still standing. As the months went by, our friendship deepened. We spent more time together, laughing over coffee or wandering through the town. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, my heart began to heal. The scars from Alex and Linda's betrayal didn't disappear, but they began to fade, no longer defining every part of who I was. One day, as I stood in the bookstore, watching Anna rearrange a shelf, I realized something. For the first time in years, I felt hopeful. Not just for the future, but for myself. I had built a life here, one that was simple and quiet but full of possibility. I didn't know where things with Anna would go, but that was okay. For now, it was enough to know that I had found someone who cared, someone who saw me for who I was. And for the first time in a long time, I began to see myself that way too. Building a new life hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. I had learned how to stand on my own, how to find joy in the little things, how to trust again. And while the pain of the past would always be a part of me, it no longer felt like it defined me. For the first time, I felt like I had a future worth looking forward to. Years passed, and the life I rebuilt became something I could truly call my own. The small town that once felt foreign became my sanctuary, a place where I could grow without the weight of my past holding me back. My days were full of quiet joys. Morning walks by the lake, evenings spent in the bookstore talking to Anna, and weekends exploring new trails. I had carved out a life of simplicity and contentment, one that felt worlds away from the chaos and betrayal I had left behind. Anna became more than just a friend. Slowly, our connection deepened into something that felt real and steady, like a foundation built to last. She had this way of making the world feel less heavy, of reminding me that I didn't have to carry everything alone. There was no rush, no pressure. Just two people learning to trust and care for each other at their own pace. I didn't tell Anna about Alex or Linda often. They rarely came up anymore. But when they did, she listened with the same quiet understanding that had drawn me to her in the first place. Her presence reminded me that the world wasn't all bad, that love could be something gentle and kind instead of destructive and selfish. Then, one day, Alex reached out. It started with a text, his name lighting up my phone for the first time in years. "Can we talk?" he wrote, as if the years of silence and the damage he had done could be erased with 3 simple words. My initial reaction was anger, a gut-deep fury that he would dare reach out after everything. But curiosity lingered too. What could he possibly want after all this time? Against my better judgment, I responded, agreeing to meet him in a neutral place. I told myself I wasn't doing it for him. I was doing it for myself. Maybe this was the closure I needed, the chance to finally put everything to rest. We met at a cafe in a nearby town, a place where no one would recognize us. Alex looked different. Older. Wearier. The cocky smirk he used to wear like a badge of honor was gone, replaced by a subdued expression I almost didn't recognize. He fumbled with his coffee cup, clearly unsure of where to begin. His words came out in a rush, a mix of apologies and excuses that felt rehearsed. He told me Linda had left him years ago, that their relationship had been a disaster from the start. He admitted he had been jealous of me his whole life, that his actions had been driven by his own insecurities and need to prove something to himself. I listened without interrupting, my face unreadable. I didn't owe him anything. Not my forgiveness, not my sympathy, not even my time. But as he spoke, I felt something unexpected. Pity. He looked like a man who had lost everything and didn't know how to pick up the pieces. When he finally stopped talking, he looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen before: vulnerability. He asked if we could move forward, if we could try to be brothers again. I thought about it for a long moment. About the years of torment he had caused me, about the life I had lost because of his betrayal. And then I thought about the life I had now, the peace, the freedom, the happiness I had fought so hard to build. I told him no. Not out of anger, but because I had no space for him in the life I had created. Forgiveness didn't mean reconciliation. I had forgiven him in my own way, enough to let go of the bitterness that had once consumed me. But I wasn't willing to let him back in, to risk reopening old wounds. He nodded, as if he had expected my answer, and left without another word. Watching him go, I felt a strange sense of relief. It was over. Not just the conversation, but the weight of everything that had come before it. That night, I told Anna about the meeting. She didn't try to sway me one way or the other, simply listening as I worked through my feelings. By the time I finished, I realized something. I didn't feel anger or sadness anymore. I felt free. The past would always be a part of me, but it no longer defined me. Alex, Linda, my family, they were chapters in a story that I had already finished. Now, I was writing a new one, with pages full of peace, love, and the kind of happiness I never thought I'd find again. As I sat with Anna on the porch that evening, watching the sun set over the town that had become my home, I felt a quiet sense of contentment. Life hadn't turned out the way I had planned, but maybe that was okay. I had built something better, a life that was mine, shaped by resilience and the courage to move forward. And for the first time in a long time, I felt truly at peace.